The candles flickered between us like they were holding their breath, waiting to see if I would break first. 6 months of marriage, and my husband had just looked me dead in the eyes at his own sister's wedding reception and said the words that would end everything I thought I knew. "I've loved someone else this whole time." The string quartet kept playing. Nobody else at the table noticed, but my whole world had just cracked open in front of 200 guests and a 3-tier cake. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life you thought was already whole, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Humanity Tales, because stories like this one are just getting started. My name is Elena Marsh, and 8 months before that wedding, I had been the happiest I'd ever been. I met Daniel Cole at a friend's housewarming party, and within a year we were married in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. He was charming in that effortless way, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee after hearing it once, who called his mother every Sunday, who cried during the vows he wrote for me. I believed, with my whole chest, that I had found the person I was supposed to spend my life with. But marriages are strange things. They reveal themselves slowly, in the small hours and the ordinary moments, not just in grand declarations. About 4 months in, I started noticing things. Daniel would step outside to take calls he never used to step outside for. His phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, started living in his pocket like a second heartbeat. He'd come home late from work with a distracted look in his eyes, as if part of him were still somewhere else, with someone else. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself new marriages had growing pains. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative was too frightening to hold. The night of his sister Marissa's wedding, I had spent an hour curling my hair, choosing a blush pink dress because Daniel once said pink looked beautiful against my skin. I wanted foolishly to remind him why he'd chosen me. We sat at the family table, surrounded by candlelight and white roses, and I reached for his hand under the table the way I always did during toasts. He didn't take it. He just stared at his glass like it held answers he didn't want to say out loud. Then he turned to me, and in a voice so low only I could hear it over the quartet, he confessed. He told me there had been someone else in his heart the entire time we'd been together. A woman from his past, someone he'd never fully let go of, someone whose name I won't repeat because she doesn't deserve space in this story. He said he'd tried to make our marriage work, tried to convince himself that time would fade what he felt for her, but standing in that ballroom, watching his sister marry the love of her life, he couldn't lie anymore. Not to himself, not to me. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was humiliation, dressed up in silk and candlelight, served to me in front of family I'd grown to love, in a room full of people toasting to forever while my own forever was quietly dissolving. My hands went cold, my vision blurred at the edges. Every version of myself that had built a life around this man, the one who color-coded our bookshelf together, who planned anniversary trips a year in advance, who genuinely believed she'd found her person, all of her stood at a cliff's edge in that instant. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom in front of an audience. Sometimes it forces something out of you that you didn't know was there. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I sat very still for a moment, feeling the weight of his confession settle over me like snow, cold and quiet and absolute. And then I said something that made Daniel's face change entirely, something he clearly never saw coming. I told him I already knew. Not in some vague, intuitive sense. I told him that 3 weeks earlier, I had found messages on an old laptop he'd forgotten was linked to our shared cloud account, messages between him and a woman named Vivian, spanning back years, long before we ever met, and continuing quietly through our engagement and our wedding day. I told him I had read every single one. I told him I knew about the coffee shop on 5th Street where they still met sometimes under the guise of catching up. About the way he signed his messages to her with words he'd never once said to me in our own vows. I told him that I hadn't confronted him immediately, not because I was weak, but because I needed time to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be on the other side of this. Someone who begged a man to love her fully, or someone who walked away with her spine straight and her heart intact. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. The confidence that had carried him through his confession evaporated. He had expected tears, maybe pleading, maybe the version of me that would beg him to choose our marriage over his old feelings. He had not expected a woman who had already grieved the relationship in private and arrived at the table that night simply waiting for him to be honest enough to end it himself. I stood up from the table, smoothed the front of my pink dress, and told him calmly that I hoped Vivian made him as happy as he clearly wished she could. Then I walked out of that ballroom with my head high, past his stunned mother, past his sister's confused new husband, past 200 guests who had no idea the quiet earthquake that had just occurred at table 12. I didn't cry until I reached my car. And then I cried the way you cry when you're not just losing a marriage, but the version of your future you'd already started building in your mind. The weeks after were brutal in the way grief always is: messy, non-linear, arriving in waves at inconvenient hours. I moved out of our shared apartment and into my sister's spare room. I stopped wearing the ring almost immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to sell it for months, like some part of me was still negotiating with the past. I threw myself into work, into long runs at 6 a.m. before the sun fully rose, into rebuilding an identity that existed outside the word wife. There were nights I sat on my sister's kitchen floor and asked myself, out loud, what was wrong with me, why I hadn't been enough. It took me a long time to understand that the answer wasn't about my worth at all. Some people carry unfinished chapters with them into new relationships, and no amount of love from someone else can force those chapters closed. Daniel's inability to let go of Vivian was never a referendum on who I was. It was simply his own unresolved story, one I happened to walk into the middle of. Slowly, painfully, something in me began to shift. I started writing again. Something I'd abandoned in the busyness of being a wife. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift during the marriage. I traveled alone for the first time in my life, spending 10 days in Portugal where nobody knew my name or my story, where I could simply exist as a woman rebuilding herself one sunrise at a time. I discovered, somewhere between the cobblestone streets of Lisbon and the quiet mornings by the coast, that I actually liked the person I was becoming, not the wife I had been. Not the woman who had shrunk herself to fit inside someone else's divided heart. Just me, whole, curious, capable of joy that didn't depend on anyone else's presence to exist. A year later, I heard through mutual friends that Daniel and Vivian hadn't lasted either. Apparently, the fantasy of what could have been rarely survives contact with the reality of daily life, and whatever he thought he'd find with her, he didn't. I felt something unexpected when I heard the news, not vindication, not satisfaction, just a quiet, distant sadness for the family we might have been, followed almost immediately by relief that I hadn't spent my life waiting for a man who was never fully present in the first place. I want to pause here and ask you something. If this story has moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need these words today. Stories like Elena's remind us that heartbreak, as devastating as it feels in the moment, is sometimes the very thing that redirects us toward the life we were actually meant to live. Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something important. Comment below with one word that describes what second chances mean to you. I read every single one, and your words often become the seeds of future stories on this channel. Today, Elena runs a small writing workshop for women rebuilding their lives after heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. She says the version of herself who sat frozen at that wedding table would be proud of who she eventually became, not because she won some silent competition with Vivian, but because she chose herself when no one else did. She often tells her workshop members that the most powerful sentence you can ever say to someone who breaks your heart isn't a scream or a plea. Sometimes it's simply the quiet, devastating truth I already knew. And then walking away, not in anger but in peace, toward a life that was always waiting for you to claim it.